Good morning and good afternoon for those who are joining from across the Atlantic, and I know we have folks joining from there. On behalf of the bipartisan Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, the German Marshall Fund in the United States, we want to welcome you to today's conversation focused on democracy with Congressman David Price, Ambassador Norm Eisen, and also my colleague Reta Jo Lewis, who's going to be moderating the conversation today. And I want to thank everybody who's joining online for being here for this conversation, but also really to our speakers, because I know it's a busy morning, especially for Congress with votes happening. And so we really appreciate Congressman Price, you joining. My name is Jonathan Katz. I am the Director of Democracy Initiatives at GMF, but also the Director of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, which is a group based in Washington, but also includes partners across the Atlantic as well, focused on democracy promotion and human rights. Today's conversation will be the first of several that we're going to have focus on the issue of democracy promotion, both at home and abroad, which has been laid out by President Biden as a priority for the administration. Many of you may have seen over the last couple of days, the administration lay out its democracy agenda in the National Security Strategic Guidance, which is an interim guidance on national security issues. But what was really interesting about that document was how heavily focused it was on democracy promotion in the United States and things that need to be done. And so we're really, it's great to have the Congressman here today, also Ambassador Eisen as well, because the democracy agenda as laid out by the administration, which is ambitious, and for many are deeply appreciative that this will be a major focus of the administration's ambitious, but it also requires a deep and an important role, leadership role as policymakers of Congress. And so I think, Congressman, we couldn't have a better person. I know we'll do a full introduction because you played such a role on this issue, both at home, but also abroad. And how do we approach these issues? And so today's conversation, as I said, will be one of many, and we're just really pleased that we could have this conversation today. And I know even before we started today, there was conversations about HR1 and what needs to be done. I can't wait to get into this conversation because I think it has become central, including after January 6th, to the challenges facing the U.S. At home and abroad, from the issues of extremism to addressing corruption. But what I like most is that you're thinking about what we do here in the United States to set the example globally for action. And so with that said, what I'm going to just quickly, just in terms of the event today, it's on the record. We would ask that our participants, if they have questions to throw out, can go to the Q&A button in Zoom and to pose a questions, feel free to do that throughout. And we welcome hearing from you. Again, this is a process of hearing back and getting feedback on these issues. So I'm going to turn the floor over to GMF Senior Fellow and Director of Congressional Affairs, Reta Jo Lewis. I just wanted to highlight that Reta Jo has held numerous senior positions in previous administrations, State Department, but also is a real leader, I think really appropriate for this conversation, at bringing together transatlantic legislators together. And this has been a goal and mission of GMF, and Reta Jo has led this effort. And it's critical because it's the counterparts in Europe that will also be leading efforts domestically to meet the challenge of democracy, not only abroad, but at home. And I think this is the key component. So Reta Jo, thank you always for your leadership and also for moderating today's discussion. I'm going to turn the floor over to you right now to kick us off. Reta Jo, over to you. Mute button.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jonathan. This is such a timely conversation for us to be having here today, and to be able to be here with two experts, one in the Congress and one who, as the ambassador, who have served in numerous administrations and working on these issues for such a long time. As we work to find new ways to further democracy, we must not forget the important role that Congress plays in shaping and strengthening U.S. democracy's agenda. And so this topic that we have is so appropriate because we're going to have first up Congressman David Price, who is the co-chair of the House of Representatives Democracy Partnership. And then we're going to also be joined by Ambassador Norm Eisen, who's a senior fellow at Brookings Institution and the co-chair of the Steering Committee on Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. But before that, and I turn to the Congressman, I just want to be able to say that, you know, Congressman Price, you have been the author of over 4 books on Congress. You've been talking and writing about the American political system, you know, as a political scientist, someone who is from the great state of North Carolina. You currently serve on a number of committees, of which are going to be, I believe, cross-cutting in this conversation. Everything from Budget Committee, Appropriations Committee, Homeland Security. And so as someone who is a foreign policy expert, let alone the co-chair of the House Democracy Partnership, you know, it is for us an honor and a privilege at GMF to have you here today. So, you know, I really want to kind of start with you and kind of, you know, ask you, Congressman, you know, given the Biden administration who has declared priorities to strengthen democracy at home and abroad, can you tell us or tell this audience about the strategy that Congress is working towards to do the same, and what steps can Congress take to complement the Biden administration domestic agenda?
Well, thank you. I appreciate the chance to join you today. I'm in a room off the House floor, and we'll have to briefly exit to cast a most worthwhile vote against gun violence. But otherwise, we'll be able to be part of this program with Norm Eisen. I'm very, very happy to do that and appreciate the invitation. You asked me to set the scene a little bit, and I will try to do that both with respect to the situation the administration faces and the challenges we face in the Congress. We're having this conversation, of course, at a very critical time with the advent of a new administration that has promised to reverse American democratic backsliding, to reverse that backsliding at home and to reverse that backsliding in our international undertakings. We have this conversation at a time when democracy worldwide is facing serious headwinds. Freedom House, for 14 years running now, has found more countries suffering net declines in political rights and civil liberties than registering gains. And of course, as we well know, that has penetrated well into NATO and EU countries. We're in a situation where China, Russia, other autocratic governments are extending their international outreach and offering competition on the ground, and they see it as competition and treat it as such, especially the Russians, in terms of the form of government and democratic practice. And we are having this discussion at a critical time in our own country, where we've had a failed but shocking attempt to overturn an election and to deny the peaceful transfer of power. That's shaken our confidence that many people had, I think, in the inviolability of our institutions and our democratic practices. Certainly tarnished our worldwide example. All of this has led to some soul-searching discussion as the new administration comes in. First of all, about the need for a reaffirmation of commitment to democracy, and some of that has taken the form of seeking to hold a democracy summit. But there's also been some discussion of exactly what form that should take, and some interesting and important discussions, I think, about the way this should be handled. Certainly, there's a strong case for a somewhat modified approach, focusing first on self-correction and the repair of democracy here at home. And then secondly, perhaps on smaller scale, initial regrouping among democratic friends and allies to determine how best to move forward more inclusively in consolidating and strengthening democracy. Now, what do we face with respect to the role of Congress? You've mentioned H.R. 1 and the domestic reform agenda, especially given what's going on in the American states. I think it's extremely important to pass H.R. 1, or at least some version of H.R. 1, which is the comprehensive reform bill that deals with everything from drawing districts to money in politics to voter suppression, the full range of democratic reforms that must be addressed, particularly given what's going on in the states. I think the Congress must take a strong public stance when regimes turn authoritarian, or when violent suppression occurs, or when basic norms are violated. For example, we're preparing at this moment a pair of Burma resolutions, which I do believe fit that specification. We need to have hearings and oversight, spotlighting, focusing effectively on democratic practice at home and abroad. For example, tomorrow I serve on the State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee. We're having a briefing tomorrow on democracy strengthening and legislative strengthening with the NDI and IRI and other proponents and practitioners appearing before our subcommittee. The first time in a long time we've had a roundtable or a hearing on that subject. We need to fully fund democracy support in the Congress as a component of our foreign aid budget. We need to understand that while it may not be the most glamorous or the headline grabbing aspect of foreign aid, and of course other components like global health are critically important, but still governance is basic. Governance is basic to everything else, and the promotion of good, effective governance in our friends and allies and partners and aspiring partners around the world is a critically important part of foreign aid. You know, we had some success on this during the Trump administration. The Trump budgets were just atrocious in this department, as I'm sure everybody on this call understands. And we did have some measure of bipartisan support to restore the democracy promotion budget, to keep support strong for the Millennium Challenge program, which is the foreign aid program that's most directly related to democratic performance. We need to redouble those efforts and to make sure that everyone understands the importance of this as part of this country's foreign aid portfolio. And then we need to engage in outreach ourselves as an institution. And that's where the House Democracy Partnership comes in, which I expect we'll talk about more later. But we do lots of outreach here with the membership in the Helsinki Commission, membership in the NATO Assembly, various kinds of parliamentary relationships, including some supported for years by the German Marshall Fund. Which we need to, of course, keep those going. And then we need to directly engage member to member, staff to staff. And that's the niche of the House Democracy Partnership. We're the only body in either house that engage in this kind of direct engagement. We have valued partnerships with IRI, with NDI, working on the ground. We give their efforts some cachet and some member buy-in, and they certainly give our efforts some substance. I don't care how intensely we engage or how often we're in these countries or how often we bring their members here. We still have to have that work on the ground with day-to-day practice in the legislatures, and we need to, in this body and everybody else involved, needs to understand the HDP maxim that as important as free and fair elections are, what happens between elections is possibly even more important, because it is at that point that effective and inclusive and legitimate institutions either perform or don't perform. And the HDP mission is to enhance performance mutually, to learn from each other and to enhance performance in this work in progress that we call representative democracy. So thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Do you have time for one follow-up question before you? I know you want to leave and go vote before we turn to you.
Yes, I'll be back, but I'm happy to take one if you wish right now.
Yeah, let me just follow up on one thing you just said. You talked about the member to member being on the ground, being staff to staff, and then the hearing that's going to take place with the NDI and the IRI. Can you just speak briefly also about the importance of all of this work being done in a bipartisan way?
Yes, I should have said that because in a time when everything is about as polarized and divided as you could imagine, this is an area. This parliament to parliament work is an area that we have kept resolutely bipartisan, and that's true through the 15 years of our history. I'm currently the chairman, but Vern Buchanan of Florida is the co-chairman, and we maintain that bipartisan approach, just as we did when Peter Roskam was chairman, or David Dreyer, and I was the co-chairman. So we have maintained that, and it's very important to do so. And we've had a pretty good experience, as I said earlier, in maintaining bipartisan support House-wide or Congress-wide for the democracy promotion components of the budget. And fortunately, we had Mark Green, a very strong IRI veteran, congressional veteran, as USAID head for most of the Trump administration. I mean, we've had some things going for us that meant that those Trump budgets that came down weren't accepted, and so the work didn't falter in ways that it might have. On the other hand, I would say democracy promotion in our foreign aid budget hasn't been at full strength for a long time, and that includes the Obama administration. I mean, I do think there's work to do here, and it's bipartisan work. And fortunately, I think we do have a good bipartisan basis for that. There always are rumblings, about how much money we're spending on foreign aid, and even global health sometimes threatens to come unstuck. We've just got to understand that this is in our national interest. This expresses our values as a nation, and we need to just really, really push to maintain this bipartisan approach.
Congressman, thank you. I'm going to turn over to Ambassador Norm Eisen, who is also going to kind of give us some opening comments. Ambassador, you were the Czech Republic from 2011 to 2015, and now you are a senior fellow in governance at Brookings, which is a globally recognized authority on law, ethics, and anti-corruption. For someone like yourself who has as a special counsel for House Judiciary and just a noted author on a lot of these subjects, it would be set the scene for our audience as to why, as your resume is so full with efforts around voter protection, and you heard the Congressman just spoke about, HR 1 trying to be passed. You heard him talk about the efforts that are going on in different U.S. states. As a special counsel, since he has laid out the strategy of the HDP, can you talk about how your work is not only motivated by the desire to strengthen democracy in, say, its broader terms, but how it actually fits into the strategy of Congress and the Biden administration?
I'd be happy to, Rita Jo. I'll just start by wishing everybody a good day and thanking them for listening in today. I'm honored to be here with my Obama administration State Department colleague, Reta Jo Lewis, and of course with Representative Price. And I would be remiss if I did not thank all of the scholars and staff at GMF, including our colleague Karen Donfried, and the co-sponsor today, the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, our new executive director, Jonathan Katz, who's doing a wonderful job of keeping TDWG moving along. And to answer your question, Rita Jo, in my role as a former founder of a DC watchdog organization, as a White House ethics czar, and then as an ambassador who was very active working not just in the Czech Republic, but regionally and globally on issues of democracy and fighting corruption. I'm a great admirer of the House Democracy Partnership that Representative Price chairs with Representative Vern Buchanan of Florida. The framework that he laid out to enhance democracy promotion performance mutually among nations, along with the partnership's many other activities. I would point to the Protect Democracy in Burma Act as a specific, very recent example. Is such an important contribution to discourse around democracy in the US and globally. And that bipartisanship point was so very important because the House Democracy Partnership reminds us that beyond the spotlight where there are some partisan clashes, these issues are really bipartisan ones, and it's still possible for Congress and for all of us to work on them in a bipartisan fashion. I like to think that that's what we do at the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, which is housed at GMF and represents a coalition of nearly 200 former government officials, democracy activists, national security experts that I co-chair. I'm the, much like the House Democracy Partnership, I'm the liberal co-chair, and Jeff Gedman, who I worked with as when he was the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty head in Prague when I was ambassador there. He's my conservative co-chair, and our 200 participants come from every point of the political spectrum, representing more than 60 organizations on both sides of the political aisle. And we mirror the work and try to carry forward the good work that groups like the House Democracy Caucus do. Our thesis is that that transatlantic democracy is the foundation of our shared security, and we work together to advance that central principle that democracy is not just a human rights issue, but a security issue. I think the tenets of American leadership on this and the bipartisan nature of our commitments carried us through the past 4 years when there was not the executive branch leadership that we would have liked. So we had the leadership in Congress, not just by Congressman Price, and Congressman Buchanan, and the members of the House Democracy Caucus, but by so many on both sides of the aisle. And now we're returning to a very vibrant whole of government commitment to those values that the congressman talked about, those really nonpartisan values of democracy promotion. You referred to my ambassadorship, and the Czech Republic is a place where there have been so many epic struggles, Rita Jo, of democracy versus authoritarianism, and openness versus intolerance, and freedom versus oppression. They've played out over the past century. And that's a place where, again and again, in the foundation of that country, after World War I, in the rescue of that country in World War II, and then in fighting and winning the Cold War and the triumph of democracy in 1989, and the vibrant democracy that has been built since in that country, supported by those on both sides of the aisle in Congress, administrations of both parties. I witnessed firsthand how a century of American democracy-minded, bipartisan activism by lawmakers, individuals, NGOs use the US paradigm as a guide in their own efforts. And that status, our traditional and what is, I hope, are now restored heft on the global stage, is going to be so important to carrying democracy forward with all of its challenges in a vibrant way in the 21st century. So and then one last point I'll pick up on in answering your question and responding to the Congressman. It's so important, and you see this in the Biden administration's interim national security strategic guidance. And I really commend that to the attention of folks because, like the Congressman, and as your question invites, that interim national security strategy talks about the importance. I won't endorse or oppose any particular legislation since I'm appearing in part in my Brookings capacity. We're not allowed to do that, but I think we can all agree on the importance of continued work to make our democracy stronger. And Congress is grappling with those issues in legislation that is under consideration. And what the Biden administration points out in their interim strategy is that only if we do that work at home, only if we fix our American democracy, can we really be credible actors abroad. Only if when Angela Merkel or Emmanuel Macron ask the president, or when he travels, Representative Price and Buchanan, when they say, look, how can we really trust America as an ally after the challenges of the past 4 years? We need to be able to say, we're not only talking about democracy on the international stage, we're fixing what's broken in our democracy here at home in the United States. That will make us a strong international partner. It makes us a good role model. So I think that centering the conversation around fixing what is broken in American democracy is very important as well. And very delighted to be with you to discuss all of that.
No, absolutely, Congressman. Thank you for joining us again. Let us know when you have to leave again, and we will come back.
I'm good. We're out for the week, so I'm all yours. Thank you.
I love it. That's great for our audience. Congressman, when the HDA was founded, there were certain strategies that we wanted to employ. And now we fast forward to 2020 of a new election, and in 2021 of a new administration. And then before he takes office, but throughout that, you have a Joe Biden who talks about holding this democracy. And then you talk to the ambassador talking about us having to fix our own democracy as we work together. What have you been saying to your constituents? Or what have you been saying to your fellow members that are not on the committee and not on the committee as to the urgency of what needs to be done?
I think the program that I briefly lined out, and as I heard most of what Norm said, was he was also saying, is that we do need to have a lot of discussions, soul searching internally about the functioning of our own democracy, our own house for that matter, but also the larger democratic environment. And everyone knows that has become a more difficult conversation. It's never been more important. Witness the recent events, but it's also very difficult to get bipartisan support. People remember wistfully Shays Meehan and McGain Feingold, the days when these reform issues were bipartisan, or certainly had a lot of bipartisan support. So we of course need to push on all fronts. That's why HR 1 is comprehensive and deals with some interrelated issues long overdue for attention. I have some components in that bill, and there's possibilities, perhaps, if the whole package doesn't make it through over various hurdles. There are more incremental steps that one might take, at least to make sure that super PACs are truly independent of candidates, or that the sponsors of ads are fully disclosed, or or that robocalls and paid internet advertising is covered in terms of disclosure. But those are important, as are the incremental. Well, they're not so incremental. They're really threats now. But the targeted measures like voter ID or same-day registration or early voting, or the kinds of things that are under attack in so many states. I'm not ready to say we need to peel those things off and address them separately. I really think they are interrelated, and we need to maintain a strong strategy of comprehensive reform. But perhaps some of this has some potential for attracting bipartisan support. That's the reason I mention it. Republicans can complain just like we do about having their campaigns hijacked by super PACs. They don't do much about it, but they do complain about it, and there is grounds for complaint. And so we need to keep pushing on that. But I cannot be very optimistic. It's much harder than it used to be, much harder than it should be, to get bipartisan support for reform. And that's all I'll say about it. But they've gone pretty far down the path of voter suppression in state after state. On the international front, as I said, I think there's considerably greater potential. We face headwinds within the Congress in terms of the foreign aid budget and our democratic commitments abroad. But we have maintained with HDP and with I would say the other efforts like our NATO Assembly Group and the groups that work internationally, the groups that the German Marshall Fund has supported, the German study group in particular. These are efforts that are bipartisan, have pretty much stayed that way and need to stay that way. And so it's a mixed picture, but I think the notion that this should be a national issue, these are national values, that's worth saying over and over again.
Before we turn to the summit, Ambassador, can you just kind of give us you with several authors wrote or published the Democracy Playbook last year. Why did you all believe and how has that been received since that's been published?
Well, Rita Jo, one of the things that has changed in my life since the pandemic is I've been doing a lot of cooking. And when I went back into the kitchen, I found that I couldn't just throw those meals together. I needed a cookbook. And the same is true with democracy. You need to have the recipe book of the best practices. And in particular, you need to know whether it's American democracy or talking to our allies abroad or backsliding democracies or folks in democracies where there's been substantial retrenchment. What are the best practices that are supported by the evidence? And what we tried to do with the Democracy Playbook, and it was a Brookings product, and TDWG and GMF participated and helped support that. What we tried to do was get together a brilliant group of social scientists who studied the actual data about what does and does not work when you're in a backsliding democracy, what's proven to help stop the backsliding and then start the forward movement again. I know it had a big impact on my life because if readers look at it, you'll see, for example, that one of the things that the evidence teaches us is that those who are in power, and this affected Congressman Price too, those who are in power need to use every lever. When you have somebody, a leader, who's trying to undermine democracy, as the head of the previous administration, the ex-president, was doing, including impeachment tools. It turns out that impeachment is an empirically supported response that plays an important role. So I know it affected my life because I ended up as the impeachment counsel for the House Judiciary Committee. And I was motivated by that evidence. That's only one of hundreds of specific steps that need to be taken. In the United States, the democracy protection effort by those of both parties, let me say, that I most often work with, my most frequent partners are conservatives who are concerned about these trends in the United States. That was very effective. And I know I've heard from folks around the world that they use some of the other specific examples in there to try to defend their democracy, including where you have a Putin or an Orban or an Erdogan. Of course, Putin's deterioration is the most severe, but Orban and Erdogan have really attacked their democracies, tools to push back on that and defend democracy.
Let me just say that I think parliamentary strengthening itself is a hedge against democratic backsliding. And of course, everybody's aware of its limitations, and we in our HDP array of partners have plenty of examples of parliaments that waxed and waned, let's say, in terms of their ability to be effective institutions with some degree of independence. But of course, we've never pretended that the American constitutional model was ideal for export. We have an appropriate degree of humility, I think, always have had, about the functioning of our own democracy and the way that different countries find their different constitutional paths with respect to the parliament's role, and some modified parliamentary system, of course, is much more common than anything like the American system. Having said that, in promoting parliamentary effectiveness, whatever the exact constitutional arrangement might be, in promoting parliamentary effectiveness, which does involve, I think, irreducibly, some degree of capacity for gathering information and expertise, that is to say, some professional staff and research capacity. I think it irreducibly involves some kind of budget scrutiny, and if not full-fledged public hearings, at least some degree of scrutiny of the ministries and the bureaus by parliamentary bodies, and so on. In promoting that, and in saying, no, it's not American checks and balances, but there is here a reason for Parliament to exist as a unique voice of the full range of interests in the society, and to function effectively in giving voice to that. I think just that institutional emphasis is itself, as I say, a hedge against democratic backsliding. It's certainly prone to subject to failure and subject to faltering, but it is at the heart of what we're trying to do and trying to encourage in these partner countries.
So, Congressman, as you talk about Parliament being a hedge, there's a lot of conversation and wide acceptance now from the new administration that the American people have a major role in this. How has the HDP brought in the American people's voice in terms of groups, organizations to participate in this conversation? And how do you really believe, or how do you think they will be that here? Norm, Ambassador, I'd like to hear your comments on that too.
Well, I don't know that we've done as effective a job as we should have of telling the story and spreading a wider awareness of not just HDP in particular, but the importance of the work in broader terms. One reason I welcome a forum like this one is we always like to tell the HDP story and make sure that there's a wider awareness. But it's been a struggle, I would say, over the years to get this fully recognized, even within our own institution, as a kind of diplomatic arm of the House, doing very specific work with partner legislatures at a critical stage of their own development. Okay, that's a mission. It's a mission of the House. I'm not sure every House member is fully aware of that. So we do have some work to do in that regard. Let me just quickly take a variant of your question and say, and ask about the public engagement overseas with the parliaments that we're working with. That is a major theme of our work with them. Some of those memorable visits we all can remember are where we visited town meetings or similar gatherings that at our encouragement, our parliamentary partners put on, and it was not always something they were accustomed to doing. I remember some pretty interesting encounters in places like Liberia and Peru, where we were dealing with meetings where the local MPs all, wanted it to be all about us and their constituents questioning us, and we said, no, that's not what this is about. please, here is your representative. Have at it. It's and we have focused on constituency offices. We have made a practice when we visit a country of not just visiting the capital, but always visiting a provincial town and work and going with the MP to their own districts. I mean, in various ways we tried to convey a message. And again, this, even in countries that elect members from national lists, totally, there still is a local tie, a question of service and legitimacy that demands local presence, I think, and we have tried to be supportive of parliaments moving in that direction.
So, Ambassador,
yeah, that is so on point, because I found when I was ambassador, and I had the privilege of having many, usually bipartisan congressional delegations. And Rita Jo, I feel sure you and I must have talked about or worked on some of those together, because I know how much work you did with Congress in the Obama administration. That we would come and we would talk to our Czech and sometimes our European colleagues, because we tried to make Prague a gathering place for invite the other American ambassadors to talk about these issues of democracy, corruption on a regional basis, and say, look, we're walking this path together. And America has its own ups and downs, and you have your own ups and downs. And let's talk honestly. And we would bring the Czech activists, bring the activists from the region to have an honest conversation. And I think in a nonpartisan way to say, we're going to hold the United States accountable. We know we're not perfect. And hey, you're not perfect either. How can we talk about improvements in both countries? And put those local folks, give them, model how we do it in the United States, that we're open to the scrutiny. It can be I was an administration official myself. And I worked on the Hill as the special counsel for the impeachment. And sometimes we would get, in those government jobs, you get uncomfortable questions about your own conduct. And I would welcome that. In fact, during my most recent tour as impeachment counsel, we had a call. At some points, it was almost a daily press call that we would do, where we would let the press ask their hardest questions about what we were doing and whether it made sense or not. And so I think that's the best tradition. It's a bipartisan tradition, and we need to welcome that, and we need to model it. And that's a very effective way of, as the Congressman notes, that's a very effective way of showing our local interlocutors, our host countries, how we do it in the States, and encouraging their own activists to question them. So I wholeheartedly associate myself with his approach.
Congressman, we're all sitting here in front of this, and it's all because as you work on these kinds of things, what do you think the impact of COVID has been, as well as questions they're trying to say in this season, or in this critical time, authoritarian leaders are, and how do we push back on that with U.S. as well as with?
I'm afraid you're going in and out on me a little bit with respect to the sound, but I think I understood the question having to do with what kind of results we can identify, particularly in pushing back against authoritarian leaders. Is that
Yes.
Is that right? All right. Well, that's always a question that we confront. You know, in our internal choices about where to deploy our resources, where to engage, where to you know, not have quite as high an expectation or an investment. And in of course, foreign aid budgets, there need to be questions asked about impact and effectiveness. In the days where this work was first beginning, which was in Central and Eastern Europe with the Frost-Sullivan Commission back in the early 90s, as communism fell and the Soviet Union broke up, and all of these parliaments in Central and Eastern Europe had to all of a sudden become real parliaments. Back then, the effort was the Frost-Sullivan Commission was much more focused on technical proficiency. I would say, you know, building up the libraries, research capabilities. Staff would go over months at a time and help train staff, and so there were measures there, such as accession to the EU or to NATO, and just other indications that these parliaments were pretty much functioning at the European standard, or certainly we're getting there. And so it became it was a problem then, but it was resolved often by that kind of measure. Have there been peaceful transfers of power? Has there been admission to these international bodies, and so on? I think that's a little tricky, but still, it served often to determine where we could move on, and actually, more importantly, maybe where a parliament had reached the point where we could then become partners with them in reaching out to other countries. We did some of that, and still do. I think it's much more difficult now to. We're dealing worldwide with still a lot of Eastern and Central European situations, but we're dealing with situations where there's been a great deal of fluctuation. One recent fluctuation certainly that just wrecks the prospects is Burma, Myanmar. But other fluctuations have been pretty severe, like Sri Lanka comes to mind, and other countries where, and Ukraine for years was a real roller coaster of democratic development and parliamentary functioning, and the level of interest in working with us. So we gauge these things, and it's very hard to say when the parliament is really no longer a focus of our efforts. There have been some studies at USAID and other places that have tried to evaluate legislative strengthening in particular. In my opinion, have not valued it sufficiently highly, and have looked for measures maybe that were, you know, you can't be too literal about it. You really have to assume that these are investments for the long haul, and we need to measure what we can, but we also need to have some degree of tolerance for efforts that may not immediately pay off, or that we are not totally sure what the payoff will be. I'm not answering your question very well, except to say that it is a constant discussion. It's a constant discussion. How do we assess what we're doing? How do we improve what we're doing? And how do we focus our efforts given limited resources?
And so a part B of that question was also the role that COVID has played in the work that we're doing with pushing on these democratic threats around the world.
Well, that's you know, our work, as I said earlier, I think is fundamental to pushing back against authoritarian threats. But as you very well know, one of the first signs of an authoritarian move in a country is often essentially shutting down the parliament as an institution that functions effectively or independently. And so that poses a set of agonizing issues in and of itself. Do you just say this is no longer a place we can effectively work? It's not that the U.S. abandons the situation, but it's just that we have to make a realistic assessment about where our kind of engagement can pay off. sometimes we've made that call. The resolution on the floor about Burma imminently is going to not say that we're cutting them off, that they've cut themselves off. And there is, by the way, a group of parliamentarians who maybe are maybe holding out and be interesting to engage with. We don't know, but I think we have a sense of our own limits in the sense of the kind of situations we can work with, and we're also not in a position to come into a country and be actively engaged politically with one group in the parliament as opposed to another. There are limits to how directly we can be involved in situations that take a political turn for the worse. I remember one of my first experiences. I lost an election in '94, so I became more available for work with the Frost Task Force, and I remember going with an international group to Bratislava. The only trouble was that between that being planned and executed, the wrong guys had won the election in Slovakia. So you had the most unpromising group of beefy party guys from the provinces that you could ever imagine. I never had a more unresponsive audience in my life, or a less successful effort to spread the word about how legislators function. Fortunately, that government didn't stay in power in Slovakia forever, and we soon had a better situation. But there are limits, and you just need to realize what those are.
So, Ambassador, what's your take on that? And when you did the democracy book, everybody, of course, we're rushing to see what 2.0 looks like. Is there going to be a 2.0, and when would that happen? Do we need
Yes. Yes. Jonathan, I'll recruit you. Let's write 2.0, and Congressman will get you to do the introduction, and Rita Jo, you can host the webinar when we release it. I'll just very briefly add on to what the Congressman said, because we have been inspired at TDWG, and of course, Jonathan knows this well. It forms a substantial portion of his day as he juggles that and his GMF responsibilities, where we have, like the Congressman has done with Burma, in the European context, with Belarus, democratic crackdown in Belarus, with backsliding in Georgia. TDWG has been emerged as a premier bipartisan place where folks can come, including among these parliamentarians and other activists in those countries, to come and talk to Americans of every political stripe. Our 200 members, really from the ultra-conservative to the ultra-liberal, the more than 60 organizations, and ideas have come out of that, and we'll pass the baton. So, for example, the Congressman knows well the Belarus Democracy Act. That idea was germinated in part in TDWG. Jonathan, I'm mangling the title. What's it called?
I think you're talking about the Belarus Democracy Act.
Yes.
It's human rights, and I think sovereignty. There's a longer title, but it's the I think the fourth iteration of this, which I thought was a good example. What the Congressman has talked about, Congressman Price, about coming back to address these issues with Congress taking a lead, but also the work that was done externally by TDWG and others to help really populate, really in a bipartisan way, was a good example.
And Rita Jo, think of that as a relay race. We do what we can on the outside. We come up with the ideas, the coalition, and then we pass the baton for the actual legislative work to the Congressman and his colleagues and their staff. And they've just done that brilliantly on the Belarus legislation. We're now very active Georgia, many other places as well. Now, why do we need, how does that lead us to the Democracy Playbook 2.0? Because we've learned so much, and this ties together everything we're talking about. We've learned so much over the past year about how to defend democracy, including right here in the United States, in a bipartisan and nonpartisan way. And we need to add Democracy Playbook 1.0 was focused on Europe and on the world. Now we need to look hard, as the Congressman urges us to do. We need to look hard at our own democracy. What have we learned? And add those lessons, always evidence-based about what works, and focus more on how we restore, rebuild, and refresh American democracy, because the guardrails of democracy in the United States took a lot of dings and dents over the past 4 years. So that's what we'll do. We'll try to do that with 2.0 and then hand the baton off to Congress and the executive branch to do their thing in legislating.
Okay, so before we ask the Congressman's final thoughts, Ambassador, I wanted to ask you, do you have any final thoughts to talk about where you see the democracy summit?
Oh, yes, Vice President, then candidate Biden and now President Biden, Vice President Harris have made a strong commitment to do a democracy summit that brings together these issues. It'll just be a larger version of this webcast that brings together both the domestic democracy improvements that we need and the challenges. And they write about this in their interim national security strategy, and the international democracy leadership that we need. And wisely, they're letting the issues percolate for a year. They're rebuilding their credibility, and then they're planning around the end of this year to do the Democracy Summit. And it will be this hybrid of domestic and international leadership, where we don't only lead with our words, we lead with our deeds. We don't only talk the talk, but we walk the walk right here at home in the United States. And so I think they're wise to get a year under their belt and then bring everybody together and renew our commitment to democracy. So I'm super excited for that. And I've taken a lot of new energy from some of the things we've talked about today. And I want to thank you, Rita Jo. I want to thank Jonathan, and of course, thank the Congressman and GMF for hosting this marvelous conversation. As President Biden once said to me in the Obama administration, we were talking about one of the critical issues on democracy and the challenges. And he says, Norm, my grandfather, I think he said it was his grandfather, used to say, it's like mowing the grass. You just got to keep doing it. And that's what democracy is like. It's like tending a garden. So you just have to keep at it. It never stops. And that's why this conversation has been so inspirational for me. So I thank all of you for that, and we're going to keep going.
Okay, Congressman, thank you so much. We're going to let you have the last word. As he said, we're tending the garden. As we look at the role of Congress, just give us your final thought.
Well, we are indeed tending the garden, and we're reminded daily that it really is like mowing grass in the sense of needing a constant renewal. Our country's history has been each new generation realizing what the challenges of democracy were in that era, and there has been evolution and development and progress there, but there also have been grievous setbacks. And so we have this struggle in our own country that we need to have an awareness of and engagement on numerous fronts. But at the same time, we still understand that whatever our flaws, whatever our difficulties, there is much in our 230-year democratic history to be proud of, to protect and preserve. It's always moving to me to realize how much other countries do look to us. And while we're very much aware of how tarnished sometimes that picture is, it still is something to live up to. and it's a role in the world to play that no one else is going to play. And I think that's true of other parliamentary bodies in the world, as well as in our country more broadly. And so we do this with all due humility, with great awareness of our own work in progress, but also I think without hesitating to affirm the importance of these democratic values and the kind of persistence on democratic fronts progress, including the representative democracy front, the importance of this to our country's interests, our security interests, as well as our values. And we haven't fully spelled that out today, but I think everyone on this call, no doubt, knows what I'm talking about and has their own way of articulating the mix of supports that we invoke, the mix of reasons that we invoke for supporting foreign engagement and democratic development in particular. So we have a niche in the House of Representatives. I of course, fully believe in the importance of that niche and making our House Democracy Partnership work well. And we're going to be renewing that effort. And as soon as the pandemic lifts, we're doing a pandemic program, as are NDI and IRI. We're keeping a lot of that going, but we're very, very eager to get back in person with our partners and to pick up this work. And so thank you for your interest in it. Thank you for the work the German Marshall Fund's doing. And Norm, thank you for your continuing efforts. We do have indeed a lot of promise with the new administration, the Congressional shift in the Senate, other promising developments that we hopefully can build on. And so we appreciate the chance to talk about these things and draw inspiration from this group. And we invite your not just your support, but any suggestions, critiques, whatever you think might be of benefit. Thank you very much.
No, Congressman, we could not thank you, Price, enough for your time today. You and Ambassador Eisen have just really shared a great perspective on the central role that Congress plays, but also what the American people will be playing, as well as how we're going to look at this from someone in new leadership with President Biden. And so on behalf of the German Marshall Fund, on behalf of Jonathan Katz and myself, we really look forward to continue working with you, Norm, as the co-chair of the TDWG. We know we're going to be working closely with you. And so, Congressman, please just always be aware that you can look to GMF to be supportive of the efforts that you're doing. It's one of the big areas that we are covering since our inception, and definitely this year, based on all of the critical times that we find ourselves in. So we want to thank our audience, because it is always enlightening to see them participate with us in this conversation and to receive your questions. On behalf of that, we wish you all a good day.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.